I haven't vaccinated my children. I think vaccinations should be left to the individual to look at their individual circumstance and their health. So mandating any policy, I think, is really risky.
Both opponents and supporters of vaccinations have descended on Fredericton, where 3 days of hearings are underway. Politicians there are studying legislative amendments that would make vaccinations mandatory for public school students unless they have a medical exemption. Religious and philosophical exemptions would no longer be allowed. The bill was tabled last spring after 2 outbreaks of measles in the St. John area and whooping cough in the Fredericton area. Dominic Carty is the Minister of Education in New Brunswick. He joins us now from Fredericton. Hi, Minister. Nice to see you again.
Hey, thanks very much for having me back on the show.
So what's your message to people like the lady we just heard who says the government shouldn't be the ones deciding whether or not they get their own kids vaccinated?
Well, the people still would have a choice about whether they wanted to get their children vaccinated. But if they want to send their children to public school, then there's a public health issue. And it's very clear, the science is clear, that vaccines are effective. Vaccines prevent the transmission of potentially fatal diseases that up till a few decades ago killed thousands and thousands of Canadians. And that's why, as a government, I'm very proud to be part of it, to be pushing this legislation forward, because we have to think about the rights of immunocompromised kids, kids who are going through chemotherapy, who've had seen their treatments take out the effectiveness of vaccines they may have already had in their system. Those are the children who I'm concerned about, not people who are falling prey to ultimately a well-funded delusion peddled by a handful of extremely wealthy people in the US and other actors who are sowing seeds of mistrust where none should exist. And that's why we need legislation like this today, where a few years ago I wouldn't have thought it was necessary. Because now there is an organized group out there saying that vaccines are dangerous, saying that vaccines cause all sorts of different conditions that they don't. And we've got to stand up for science, for evidence, and that's why I'm very proud of this bill.
Why give them a forum, women like the clip we just had, why give them a forum to express those views when they have been so clearly debunked by scientific evidence?
Well, that's a question you'd have to ask the chair of the committee here, because I wasn't responsible for who was invited. But in the end, I think the very presence of those voices saying, just as you just said, sharing messages that are clearly debunked, that shows the fact that now there is a risk to public health posed by these groups and by these individuals who are going out there and taking advantage of parents who have experienced trauma and loss with kids who have been sick, become sick, or in some cases have died, and saying, you know who's to blame? Vaccines. And those groups behind this scam, I think groups like Vaccine Choice Canada and others, should be censured for the shameful way in which they've inflamed fears without any justification at all. So in the end, while I found it difficult to stay in the same room with some of these people who make a living peddling books and conspiracies based on lies that are dangerous for our children and dangerous for our whole society.
What would censorship
in the end, seeing them out there doing it is, I think, one of the best antidotes, and makes people realize how dangerous these groups are and why we need to make sure we protect our children.
Sorry to interrupt. What would censorship rather look like?
Oh no, censure as in just call them out for it. I don't believe you. I don't think we should restrict free speech. I think we should win these people over based on arguments. And there's a middle ground of people who are open to listening to both sides, but there's a very small number who absolutely refuse. And unfortunately, in a system with a vaccine system where you need to have 95% sort of the herd immunity that people talk about, and you've got around 3% of vaccines that for whatever reason, either the vaccine doesn't work, it doesn't hold, sometimes people don't get all of their shots, so they're not fully vaccinated, you're looking at a 2% margin of error. And in New Brunswick, we know that we've got about 1.5% of our school kids who have gotten exemptions. And so we're down to about 0.5% away from having herd immunity be lost and really exposing our whole population to serious health risks, especially our kids who are especially vulnerable to a lot of the diseases that we vaccinate against.
Does your entire caucus support this legislative amendment?
I certainly expect so. It is a bill that was approved by Cabinet, signed off on by the Caucus, and certainly that's the usual practice is the government support government bills. But I always say to any journalist who asks me questions about things that happen in the future, we'll see what happens. But my hope is, again, that reason will win out here because the science is on the side of vaccines. The evidence is there. There are not two sides to this discussion. There's the side of evidence and fact and the side of fantasy and delusion. And we have got to speak out against groups that are preying on vulnerable parents and trying to spread a literal toxin in terms of misinformation that could actually kill significant numbers of Canadians. It was only recently that we were losing thousands and thousands of citizens to easily preventable diseases. And the fact that's receded in memory now by a few decades, I think has made us complacent. It's time for the moderate majority in Canada to stand up and say it's time that we protected our kids. It's time that we insisted on only evidence-based, science-based decision-making around these sort of questions. And I think if we can do that, we'll have a healthier, happier population, better able to confront the challenges that the 21st century is throwing up against us.
I want to switch gears before I let you go and ask you about the decision to end New Brunswick's contract with the Confucius Institute for Mandarin cultural lessons in elementary and middle schools. According to the article I read about this decision, the Consul General warned you that it would impact your province's trading relationship with China. Why did you still go ahead with the decision?
Well, I think that in the end there were negotiations that resulted in that in the middle schools and primary schools no longer having the Confucius Institute that were negotiated with the Chinese. So I think that was as close to a win as I could have hoped for. And I think the Chinese, looking internationally, have got bigger fish to fry.
What does that mean?
Well, I think that when it comes to dealing with New Brunswick, I think that's a very small part of their concerns. And I want to really reiterate again, too, that whenever I speak against the Confucius Institute, that it's nothing against China or the Chinese people, and a lot of admiration for folks, especially, of course, the folks in Hong Kong fighting for their rights at the moment.
Was there a warning issued to you that trade could be impacted? That's what I had read in the paper. I think it was the National Post.
It was certainly suggested.
And what was your response?
My job is to look after the education system for New Brunswick's children.
And you're not concerned at all about the potential impact on trade? I mean, I'm asking, because there's a wider issue going on in this country where there is a lot of concern about potential blowback given the diplomatic dispute at a federal level. There are other provinces or provincial leaders that have engaged on the trade relationship, not brought up some of the domestic issues. And I'm just wondering why you chose to pursue, the path that you did despite the warnings.
Well, because I don't answer to any foreign government. I answer to the people of New Brunswick, and my mandate as education minister is to make sure that we had a New Brunswick education system where the New Brunswick government was comfortable with the education that we were providing for our citizens. So it was a no-brainer for me.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Minister Carty. Pleasure as always to have you on the show. That's New Brunswick Education Minister Dominic Carty. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.